Hi, I'm C. Morgan Babst, and I'm here today with Ladee Hubbard, winner of the Ernest J. Award for Literary Excellence and the Hurston Wright Legacy Award for debut fiction for her first novel, The Talented Ribkins. In her new novel, The Rib King, we meet the paterfamilias of the Ribkins. August Sitwell, aka the Rib King, aka the original Ribkin. Together, these two books tell the story of a family that is extraordinary in pretty much all the ways. But welcome, Ladee, to the Tennessee Williams Festival.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here.
I'm so glad to have you. I had the pleasure of reading these books back to back. I had actually read The Talented Ribkins before, but I wanted to refresh my memory of it, especially once I learned that The Rib King is almost a prequel to the book. And I found it to be a really pleasurable experience to take this journey that goes backwards in so many ways, both internally to the books, but also to the two books as they have been published. I wanted you, if you could, to read us a bit from The Rib King, where the Rib King takes us back to his origins as a child in Seminole County, Florida.
Okay. Right, so this is right at the beginning. This is like the first day, and he's remembering where he came from, because now he's part of the early stage of the Great Migration, and he's living in a city in the north, but he's originally from Florida. And he's just messed up a date. He wanted to ask someone out on a date, and it didn't go well. So it seems as if he'd messed up everything, first with the boys and then with Ginny. He tried to remember what he thought would happen that night and found that vast parts of his mind were blank. It seemed nothing but foolish to have imagined she might have liked him. She belonged with the bright, happy people who rode the streetcar, people whose eyes danced when they talk, people who swayed. The city was full of them, and as he moved down the sidewalk, they were all around him, everywhere he looked, everybody rushing past him in a hurry to get somewhere. As long as he'd been in that city, he'd never felt like he truly belonged. A part of him would always be country. His true home would always be a small village hidden in the swamps of Seminole County that, for the first 9 years of his life, was the only world he had known. Founded by 3 runaway slaves, back in the day when much of the state was still unsettled land, they'd stolen a map from the man who'd owned them, run towards its nearest edge, and then kept running, wanting nothing more than to get off it. They made a home in the swamps out of a landscape so wild and unmanageable that for a long time no one thought to claim it. Over time, they had been joined by others, runaways like Sitwell's mother and his Uncle Max, vanquished indigenous, deserters from various wars. For years, they'd kept safe by sticking together and keeping to themselves. It wasn't until after the Civil War that people like Sitwell's mother and Wash Talbot started venturing outside, lured by the promise of paper money in exchange for work in what was by then one of several nearby towns. He pulled the book out again and stared at its cover, a sneering white man whose eyes had been rendered a vivid green. And there, in the quiet of his own thoughts, he started to remember things. He remembered how, as a child back in Seminole, he'd once met a man with eyes that color, and also that when he asked who the man was and what he was doing there, his mother had told him he'd come to attend funeral services for Wash. But aside from the color of his eyes, the man on the cover, with his straight hair, long beard, and top lip curled back in a savage grin, looked nothing like the one he was thinking of. That man had been small and compact, with a smooth tan face and a high, bushy mop of brown hair. Mr. Sitwell couldn't recall the man's name, but he'd never forget the day he'd shown up on his mother's doorstep. It was the day before the shooting started and the last time he'd helped his mother bake a cake. Did you want me to?
Yeah, the next page too, if you could.
Okay.
Sorry.
Mr. Sitwell kept walking. Before she ran away, his mother had been a slave in a grand house in St. Augustine. It was there that she learned to cook. She was so good at it that even after Wash's hanging, when all the other villagers who worked in town had been sent home and told not to come back, Mrs. Farley, the woman she cooked for, has kept his mother on because Mr. Farley's birthday was coming up and Mrs. Farley wanted a cake. He rounded a corner and remembered how, when he and his mother got into the wagon to go to town that last morning, the green-eyed man had sat on their porch and waving goodbye. And when they returned that afternoon, he was still sitting there, a rifle laid across his lap. "How did it go, Lotta?" he'd asked Sitwell's mother. "About what you expected." The man helped her unload the wagon, then followed them back inside the small cabin they shared with Uncle Max. Sitwell's mother took off her jacket. She set the bag down on the kitchen table and said, "Mr. Farley called you a ghost nigger." "Did he now?" The man smiled. "Well, now, Lotta, I got to admit, that's actually kind of funny." Mr. Sitwell stared at the book's cover. Was that man Cherokee Red? A colored version to go with the colored wash? Mr. Sitwell could not recall ever seeing him before the day he showed up for Wash's funeral, and didn't remember ever being told the man's actual name. But of course he must have been told. It was just that so many people had come back to attend Wash's service, and he hadn't known which ones he should be paying attention to, hadn't known what was important to remember. It was entirely possible that other people had called the man Cherokee, and Mr. Sitwell had simply forgotten. Now, amid the noise and clatter of the city streets, the man's voice came back to him, followed by his mother's laughter. Sounds from his past which, though soothing in some ways, were not actually comforting, because he missed those sounds, and hearing them again only reminded him of how alone he now was, how far from anything that resembled home. They reminded him of a time when he'd been part of a world he hadn't paid much attention to because he'd never imagined himself being outside of it. Reminded him that his real home would always be a small village in the swamps of Florida that 25 years before he'd been forced to stand and watch as it burned to the ground.
Yeah. That passage is just so incredibly powerful that Mr. Sitwell travels back to this place of wholeness that has been so irretrievably taken from him.
Right.
And so much of both of these books is about digging, and in the case of the Talented Ribkins, literally digging for a lost, sometimes unrecoverable, sometimes impossibly corrupted past.
Right.
And so I thought it was interesting that the books taken together kind of, they move backward. And I wondered why you chose to use this intense and layered retrospection in these books to tell these stories of this family.
That's really interesting and really true, because in the first book he is kind of forced to dig. He has money buried in the ground.
Yeah.
So these are all places that he's been consciously avoiding.
Mm-hmm.
But then he's put in a position where he has to go back and revisit these places that he's been to in his past. And then in this book, there is this loss and this trauma that he's been trying very hard to repress. And he also finds himself sort of forced to sort of, it starts coming up with him. So because right before, part of the prelude to this was that he found, he works in a house, he's a servant in a house, and there are 3 boys there, and they're reading a penny novel that it's sort of evoking his past. But not really, because the story in the novel is so different. So it's sort of the thing that forces him to confront his past is the misappropriation of it, right? He has a reaction to all the things that people are getting wrong is sort of, unfortunately, becomes this really powerful trigger for him that's dredging up all these memories that he's tried really hard to repress. So in part, in both cases, it's really about how the way people try to function in the present as if the past is not connected to that present, and in both cases, sort of the premise of the novel itself in some ways is about realizing the need to reconcile the past, or being forced to find a way to reconcile it. Because obviously the choices that this particular character makes are specific to him.
Right.
And they're not the same choices that other characters in the book make, right? But he has to confront it.
Yeah. Because he reacts to his repression in an almost, equal and opposite reaction of explosive, like, retribution.
Right, and in part it is probably because he has not, he didn't have any, there's no outlet for him in another way, so it's very hard for him to understand it at that point. But I think in both cases too, I think the fact that history so deeply shapes how we move through the world in the present is not always something that we're consciously aware of or consciously want to deal with. Yeah. But it's always there with all of these characters as well, and it also very deeply shapes the way in which you are able to envision a future for yourself. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So
yeah, there's in the Talented Ribkins, the past is literally under their feet all the time. Something that can sort of reemerge as Johnny Ribkins goes digging with his niece.
Right.
And something about that process of digging things up allows Eloise to move forward into her life with more.
Right. Because you need that in that book. Yeah, that's right. So those books they're very different in a certain way, but I can see there definitely is a connection in terms of that.
Yeah.
Because also his search is it's a very willful search. And it's also very motivated by his understanding of where he wants to go. It's motivated, I need to do this so that I can deal with things today and have a future that I want. Whereas like Mr. Sitwell, in a certain sense, it's sort of, he's bombarded by his past and all of this unprocessed trauma that he has. And it just eventually becomes very overwhelming for him.
He's almost dragged back into a past against his will.
Yeah.
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 And while Johnny in the Talented Ribkins is constructing basically a map of the past for his niece,
right?
Which is his talent. In that book, all of the Ribkins who are, in some way and in some ways not related to Mr. Sitwell of this book, they have a special talent of some kind, which is, and his talent is making maps, both of the physical world and also of power, of context. And so when I read this passage that I had you read, I thought it was really interesting that Mr. Sitwell describes his home, the place where he felt whole and not separate from anything, as a place that's unmappable, that's off of the edge of maps. And I wondered whether that was a link that you'd meant to make between these two characters, and what maps mean to you as a metaphor.
Right. That's a very good question, and it's true. There are like a lot of references to the Talented Ribkins in this book, but they're all very I don't know what the word is, mutated. So I really wasn't trying. So it's like a prequel in the sense that this is the patriarch of the Ribkins, but I really was trying to make it its own story, and it has very different preoccupations, but certain links do come up, and that's very true. And I think it speaks to the different themes of the books as a whole, because the Ribkin, all of his descendants talk about him, but they don't really know
Right.
anything about his real life. All they know is this image on the can, and they all kind of make their own maps of that. So they sort of create him, and it's sort of, and in there it was a commentary on sort of tradition and the idea of history as also being a very willful act, because
Yeah.
it's kind of it's like a minstrel image, and so they have found a way to look at that and derive a sense of strength from it. And they've all sort of like, their ideas of what his experiences mean is very different, and it becomes sort of like a justification for the choices they've made in terms of how they live their lives. So in that sense, they have assumed a lot of agency in terms of mapping the past. And that's why their examples, Johnny and his cousins, are so sort of instructive or potentially instructive to Eloise, who's traveling with him, because they all sort of represent different ways to like live your life, be successful. Because that book had a lot to do with, its origins were with the W.E.B. Du Bois essay, The Talented 10. So it had a lot to do with the idea of a black leadership class, right? And sort of different routes that were possible. And I think that the idea of unmappable is that, one, it speaks to the fact that they don't really know him, right? And actually a lot of even their relationships to each other don't have anything to do with the past. It is kind of blank space. And his identity is also partially untranslatable. So it's very fast in there, like who is actually living in this community that he comes from. And I think that it is, in a certain respect, like it comes up later on in the book where he talks about, these are my people. And someone else says, well, I thought I was your people. Right. And it's he can't really articulate what he means, except that it's just the people that come from there. So there's a lot of stuff about invisibility and erasure. And then he appears, and it's sort of like Johnny's such a different character, Johnny Ribkins. It's like, no, I will take control of the situation, and erasure, I will map it for myself, and whatever works is what basically at base, right? Because it's a very willful thing to create a map out of that. And so his whole thing was that it's not really, in terms of his experience. I think he is in a lot of ways someone who, despite all appearances, is pretty overwhelmed by trauma of the past. It's not really something he feels in control of, and in a way, his reaction to it is the proof of that. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
Because it's pretty nihilistic. It's a pretty nihilistic reaction. So.
But it's also a very deeply human reaction.
I think so. I think it is. Someone asked if I thought he was a villain. I don't think he's not a villain to me. It's terrible, but he's not at all. It's and that I just wanted to sort of explore what that feels like.
Yeah, it's his context that's villainous. It's the actions of all the people around him. They get interpreted in so many ways. I thought that Frederick, one of the orphan boys at the end, sees his quest in a completely different way, calls it this romantic quest that's based on a misunderstanding of the past. Right. But of course we each have our own understanding of the past.
Exactly. Right? Yes.
And meanwhile, the Rib King, the violence that's done to him is so extreme that his identity gets lost. Yes. So that when I encountered him first in the Talented Ribkins, I'm just going to read a short passage here. This is when Eloise sees an image of him for the first time. She opened the book and pointed to a yellowed newspaper advertisement for Rib King barbecue sauce, featuring an exaggerated cartoon portrait of a smiling black man with a pair of bulbous eyes, a wide nose, and white teeth. There was a crown on his head, but it had been drawn to curve over at the points, making it look like a jester's cap. At the bottom was the caption, "Dad eats like a king." "Your legacy," Simone said. Johnny winced. He glanced at Eloise and realized he had no idea what she saw. But part of growing up in that family had been learning to read between the lines, acquiring the ability to squint to see. The Rib King's descendants had inherited no other likeness, and so embraced this one as a testament to all he had accomplished in spite of it.
Right.
And so all of the struggle that is contained within this book, all of the deep pain and trauma gets completely destroyed by this caricature that comes out of the same racist tropes that we experience across the book.
And that isn't in and of itself a mask, right? A form of erasure and not being unmappable space, his identity, right? So it's like an internal struggle, but it's also replicated by what happens to him, because that book is very the Rib King. There's a lot about masking, right? And hiding and just not being represented. Right. Erasure. His past is erased, but then it's also the condition that he's living in.
Yeah.
And the Talented Ribkins is really about very different. It's sort of about how people have coped with that. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
As part of a legacy, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, it's almost as if every single character in The Rib King is performing a role.
Yes.
And so they're all in a state of existential crisis all the time. Playing butler, wearing the butler's clothes, playing gardener, playing upstanding beauty parlor person. And yet, all of these characters come through to me, the reader, as extremely complex and authentic people. And so I wondered how you go about creating these characters who are at once performing this inauthentic personality and are at the same time conveyed to us as full humans.
Right. Well, I actually started with because that is his origins. It was part of the first novel. Was that I knew that was. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so everyone that works in the house with him, in my mind, I hope it's somewhat obscured, but they are all pretty dominant stereotypes. Mamie is like Mammy, and Jenny is like Jezebel, and then you have these three little sort of, and in the distorted version, they would be Topsy-like children, just sort of like running around the house. And then I think I started with that, but then I really thought about what it meant to feel compelled to inhabit those roles.
Yeah.
Right? Which I think is, there's a lot of performance that's required of people still, and just for jobs and, to get through the world, to navigate the world, and what kind of backstory with these characters. And then to just allow them to be real people, but aware. I think that when I wrote it too, I was very aware that if it had been told from the Barclays perspective, how different they would have all appeared, because they perform, because they are performing so much. The thing about Barclay is also performing. He's compelled to perform as well, because he's trying to make this business deal, and it's important that he appears more successful than he actually is.
Right.
So when he interacts with them, or when company's over, I should say, they're all sort of in on it together, even though they don't really talk about it. It's like there's a scene where Mamie, the cook, comes out and she's interacting with Mr. Barclay, and when I wrote it, they're really doing a commercial, because do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So he's acting as well, and they're like, "Isn't this wonderful?" and blah blah blah, and this product is so fabulous, but they're both performing.
No.
So I tried to make that very clear as well, that it's not just race, it's class, and also gender in the book, that people at various points feel compelled to perform.
Yeah. It's very true. And that moment is when they're standing in the front hall of the Barclays house, and he brings out Mamie, who made the sauce that the guy who he's trying to woo in a financial way loves. And then he brings Mr. Sitwell up, because he has got this talent where he can tell you every single ingredient that's in the book.
Right.
And you see the origins of the caricature of the Rib King in that performance there. And it made me wonder whether you had done a lot of research into the real people behind Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben, and how those caricatures came about.
I have, and that was another, that has to do with the masking and minstrelsy, because Aunt Jemima is just a minstrel, was a stock character in minstrel shows. So there's no real Aunt Jemima. Someone asked me about that, about Aunt Jemima's heirs, if they were upset because it was being removed, and I was like, I don't think she actually has. So the first time it was performed was at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893, and it was they hired a woman named Nancy Green, to perform as Aunt Jemima. So I think it's always been just totally a construction.
Yeah.
Uncle Ben is a little different. Yeah, I do. But to answer your question, I did do research I know about all of their backstories.
Yeah.
So
it must have been, having read this, but I mean, it must have been awful to be Nancy Green, or.
Again, there you go. What's
right?
my motivation? Maybe there are probably a lot of awful things.
So many awful.
Could be forced to do.
Obviously.
So
right.
not to be, I don't know. I don't know her. I don't really know that much about her, but that's actually interesting to think about, like what it was like to perform this character for money, at the time. But a lot of people, minstrelsy was it was the most popular form of entertainment at the turn of the century back then. So it was very pervasive. I think there's a lot of really interesting and strange things going on with associating minstrel images with products. Like if you're trying to establish a brand's reliability and quality, and then you associate it with this, what does that actually mean? It says a lot of really complicated things about race relations and sort of perceptions of, I don't know. The whole thing is very strange and complex. But yes, I did have to do quite a bit of research into all of that stuff.
Did.
So yeah,
it's interesting though that you have two. We have two sides of that, naming of products after people in this book.
Right.
Where you have Ribking sauce, which was the invention of Mamie in the kitchen at the Barclays house. But then you also have Jenny here, who names her face cream after Miss Mamie.
Right. That's
right. And one of them is an homage, and one of them is a denigration.
Right.
Yeah, but I wonder, it was a really strong break to move from Mr. Sitwell's point of view into Jenny's point of view.
Right.
And I wonder how that came about in your process.
Right. It was hard to write it. It made sense to me because, the book was really. Again, I keep talking about these. I think a lot of the dynamics are actually, you can see them in the present still. So there's a certain, as I've said, it's very nihilistic, the result, but there's a certain fatalistic logic to the Sitwell section, right? And it sort of progresses in a very linear way. And I was thinking in the larger sense of sort of African American cultural history. I think I don't think that is accurate in terms of sort of the Black experience, and
right.
So there's a lot of perhaps you could say illogical reactions, which are, as I said, it's willfulness and it's a sense of hope. And a sense that you will figure out a way to create your own future, but it is not as that all is sort of motivated by other things than sort of Mr. Sitwell's story. So it's it just wound up having to be a different kind of story. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I was trying to represent that through Ginny, just this, and again, it's very conscious, like she thinks her product, she wants it right up on the shelf, right next to Ribkin sauce, and she wants everyone to see it, and they're going to sort of pay respect to this woman that meant so much to her. And people around saying that is never going to happen. And she's like, well, I know this is going to happen. I'm going to make this happen. And when I think about sort of like despite everything that, has gone on in this country, all of the contributions that African Americans have made to it, there's, it's not really logical in a sense, right? It's sort of like this sort of transcendence of logic, even, I guess, would be or realism. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
You have to sort of somehow these people have the power to envision something happening, like not giving up. Because I think that if you're realistic, you probably will not accomplish very much. There's definitely something to be said for being extremely unrealistic and unwilling to just accept that, no, this is how things are, and this is, you're never gonna. That's what people hear a lot of the time. And so that's an example. It's like she represents a different kind of energy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's in some ways Jenny sort of, she just ignores all the maps.
Yes.
She's just like, I'm going to go here. This is because that's where I want to go.
And she will create her own map.
Right.
And she will keep changing it. So that's interesting too in terms of the connection to the other book, because if Mac and Mac and her daughter, that she actually, and she's not, that's very patriarchal, and it happens a lot, but she's not in the first book at all.
Right.
And I personally think she's a pretty talented and kind of incredible person, but she's not even there,
right.
Remembered in the same way.
And so, it's wonderful, because in the same way that the Rib King excavates this whole person of Mr. Sitwell out from underneath this caricature, having the book shift halfway through to Jenny, who's probably the matriarch of that branch of the Ribkins, who doesn't get any credit.
Right.
She's but we see where the drive and the ambition and the ability, this creative ability to create any number of things to work for justice, but there are all kinds of different Ribkins out there.
She's much more like Johnny Ribkins, actually, than Mr. Sitwell.
Yeah.
Actually,
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And there's something very exciting about her. And so I was, I thought throughout the thing about the Du Bois essay and the idea of the talented 10th, which your epigraph here from Du Bois. Now the training of men is a difficult and intricate task. Its technique is a matter of educational experts, but its object is for the vision of seers. And it's so much about raising children, educating people, bringing people up and into their full potential of their talent. And in some ways, both of these books are motivated by a desire to care for children. And protect them, and to make the world a better place for them, or to make them better adapted to the world that they are forced to live in. And so I wondered how your history as an educator and as a mother have influenced your work in literature.
Well, I'm sure the experience of being a mother certainly have, because I do think a lot about caretakers. I write a lot probably about caretakers and sort of the complexity of that, and sort of the uncertainty of it in terms of what you said, it's very complicated just to know how to take care of someone and to give them the things that they need. Again, it's very different impulses in both books, because I think that the Talented Ribkins was also me expressing a lot of gratitude to my grandparents, because the Johnny Ribkins is a lot of his personality is based on my grandfather, who I was very close to, and so that to me in some ways it was like a tribute to him and all the things he represented for me. And then the Rib King as well, for all the other things going on with him, he is, of course, preoccupied with these three boys and that are in the house with him and taking care of them. And that was also probably a mother's reaction, because I started writing, or at least, taking notes for the book on the characters and stuff when I was writing the Talented Ribkins. So it was a very long time ago. And it was actually when the Trayvon Martin had just happened. So it was the emergence of the Black Lives Matter slogan and stuff like that. And I think I had as many people did, but as the mother of sons that were not that much younger than he was, a reaction as a parent. And there was at that time, and this was like 2014, like there was a lot of talk about the vulnerability of African American children to racial violence. So that was very much on my mind, and I think it did, the way I perceived it and impacted me was as a parent. So thinking about, because what Mr. Sitwell is trying to do, he's trying to keep these boys safe and alive, right?
Yeah.
And it turns out to be an increasingly complicated proposition. Mm-hmm. And actually, I don't know if I hope it comes through. He tries different strategies. So at a certain point, each one of them is in danger, and he has to figure out how to deal with it. And he keeps trying different strategies, and none of them work, right? Which is part of the sort of the fatalism of his personal journey, unfortunately, mm-hmm. because it also evokes back to his own childhood again. So that the connection for me was thinking about as many things, the sort of anxiety that you might experience 100 years ago, the fact that people were still having to deal with that level of fear and anxiety today, right? Mm-hmm. So that was very much on my mind when I wrote the book as well. So it's interesting. So it's like a historical novel, but it really was about the present for me, mm-hmm. in a lot of ways, mm-hmm. And thinking about those links, right? Which you see in a very sort of muted, no one talks about it sense in these little icons like Aunt Jemima and the cream of wheat man, like when you're walking through the store, these vestiges of like the past that are not really at that time commented upon. So I was telling sometimes it was very hard to explain, like she was like, why did you write a historical novel about like a meat sauce and a caricature? And I'd be like, well, I wrote it because of, and the connection didn't really, it was sort of hard for me to explain why I was doing that. And so there was like a weird kind of symmetry for me, like this past summer, like the fact that the book is coming out right around the same time that they've said, okay, we're finally going to retire Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben and what is it, the Redskins and all of these things, like these are finally going to be sort of dealt with because they speak to a wider context that not for some reason, but that people have refused to kind of acknowledge for a very long time. So for me, there's kind of a weird symmetry in that. And the fact that that decision was motivated or compelled by all of the protests of the past summer as well. So like that's very, that was kind of wild to think about because it was the same connection, sort of the opposite side of the same connections were why I wrote the book in some ways too.
Yeah, and I think it does create those resonances. I mean, when I read, there's a passage where one of the boys is imprisoned basically mm-hmm. on a fairground, and it was, panic-inducing. You're really, really, really afraid that this little boy is never going to make it out of this cell. And he only does make it out because Mr. Sitwell appeals to his white employer.
Right, right.
Or to at least the image of him for, to save this little boy.
Right.
Who nobody is otherwise looking after. But that's what I think that's a large part of what these books are about, is they are bringing to the surface a past that has been lied about for so long that unless we actually, deal with what turns out to be a multifaceted, almost kaleidoscopic range of histories and pasts and memories, and if we don't allow those things their range, we're never going to be able to reckon with them,
right,
and to carry ourselves forward.
Yeah, I think that's really, true. I mean, I think that's what we've been dealing with for a while now. It's just that there's a lot that really needs to be worked through and dealt with in an honest way. So I was saying, just to make it small again, the Aunt Jemima, the updates, the idea that you could just update and sort of not pay attention to the origins, like, oh no, we'll still call her Aunt Jemima, but now she's like a CEO. And I'm like, why in the world would that make any sense to anyone? But apparently it's passable, and it's just a lot of obfuscation, as opposed to just really trying to confront and deal with, because it is extremely complicated. Yeah. But you can't pretend it's not there, right?
Right.
Because it's like the past for all, in both books, it's something that it shapes the present very deeply, whether you acknowledge it or not. Yeah. So, yeah.
Speaking about the book that causes all of this buried trauma to come up for Mr. Sitwell, he says that the book was, without question, telling a story about his people, the world he had come from, and yet everything it said was a lie. It was such a strange lie because it seemed to constantly remind him of the truth. And that just seemed like such a succinct and precise way of describing really, the mythologies that we tell about America and about race. I wondered why, with the academic background that you have, that you chose to tell these stories that resuscitate this history in a fictional form rather than through, academic history texts.
Right. Well, yeah, that's because that's a genre too.
Sure.
Really. No, I feel for me it's you can get to deeper truths sometimes, and in part it is because of the obfuscations of history. There's a way that there's sort of official narratives that have to be dealt with and worked through, and sometimes that's not my point. Like I don't want to go back over it. I don't want to argue with it. I don't want to waste my time arguing with it. I just want to be able to make my own connections between things. I think I always wrote stories. I wrote poems. So I've always written something. I wrote a lot of poems when I was younger. So, yeah.
So I can hear that in your language. It's
really?
It's a tightness and an imagistic clarity
that's nice. That's nice. I think I started writing fiction in college because I feel like because I wound up where Toni Morrison was, and I really wanted to show her something. So I actually think I started writing it's just an excuse to show her something. But yeah, no, I've always written. I think it took a long time for me to sort of envision it as like a profession or something for myself. Do you know what I mean? That seemed to take a very long time. So
it's hard to envision it as a profession.
Yeah.
So having someone like Toni Morrison in your mentoring history must be very powerful.
Yeah, no, it is. So you would think that I would have been like, oh, I'm going to go be a star now. But no, it just took me a while to sort of wrap my mind around all of that. It's weird because I was thinking like, I'm actually very grateful for all of the experiences that I've had, and that now I can sort of bring to what I'm doing with my writing.
Yeah.
Like in a weird way, I feel like it was for me personally necessary to have all of my experiences first, in a way. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I think it's also very clear that in these books that there's this very strong foundation of expertise in all of these these thoughts that you're bringing to the table about history and about selfhood and about, trauma.
A lot of thoughts, yes. I've thought about these things for a very long time, yeah.
There's an expert complexity to the way that they come through the narrative, which, and these are rip-roaring narratives too. They're unput-downable. So I'm grateful that you had so much to draw from.
Well, thank you.
Thank
you.
So did you get to study with Toni Morrison at Princeton?
Yeah. Yeah, she was my thesis advisor at
wow.
Princeton. Yeah.
What was that like?
It was amazing. I think I was really in awe of her. I mean, in a way, it was kind of it was really great. But I know the whole, like, now that I'm older, I wish I had been more mature about it, because I think the whole time I was sort of just couldn't believe I was talking to Toni. I was very much in awe. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, now I'm like, oh, I wish I had had like an actual, like, like an adult conversation with her. And I don't think I was capable of that at the time, because I was just always so like, she really was, I just thought she was the most incredible writer I'd ever read. Do you know?
Yeah.
Just very important to me personally. But it was really, technically, I did learn quite a bit from her and stuff like that. So
that's great.
Yeah.
It's hard to, I think it's hard to have an adult mentoring relationship with a giant like
Right,
that when you're 21.
Exactly,
right?
exactly.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, I wish, But yeah, I was 21, so I behaved like a 21-year-old too. And she was really. I'm also amazed because I think my writing was very undisciplined too. And so she really was very encouraging of these sort of really wild, sometimes very strange experiments I would do, and more so in retrospect, it's kind of like amazing to me how sort of appreciative and encouraging she was, like to just sort of push things and try different things and play with structure and stuff like that, because that's really what I was mainly doing. I mean, it was always about something, but I don't know, it was like just trying to get to like the truth of something. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And she was very encouraging of all of that, and I really appreciate it. Because imagine if it's like your idol and she's like, stop doing that or something like that. And instead she's like, no, keep going. And I was like, that's really, really, I'm really grateful for that experience.
That's a wonderful experience to have, because I feel like so much of the education that one receives as a writer is like, you have to do it this way, you have to do it this way.
Right.
When I was getting my MFA, the last class that I took was with E.L. Doctorow,
Oh.
who he just made us read all of the most wacky masterpieces of literature that had ever existed. And he's like, so you do that.
That's great.
Like, if you want to be remembered, you blow everything
Right.
up that you have learned here, now that you have your foundations.
Do your own thing. That's
Do your
right.
own thing.
Right.
Yeah. Who else would you say has been an important influence to you in your writing?
I draw upon it's hard for me to answer that question even, because I draw upon so many things and so many different types of writing that it's hard. So, like, for example, I talked about acting, and I studied drama for a really long time. So I can hear, there's like playwrights and things that really influenced me as well in terms of dialogue. And
this audience would love to hear about the playwrights.
Oh my gosh.
Probably.
Yeah, well, I always mention August Wilson in terms of dialogue, and just sort of cutting. I really like writing a lot of dialogue and then trying to cut as much as possible. Do you know? But I actually think that has more to do with like reading a lot of plays than. Do you know what I mean? It's a very satisfying feeling to see how many words you can cut out, and still what kind of rhythm is created out of cutting.
Yeah.
I think I'm very oral in general. I think I think about the sound and the rhythms of words and sentences a lot, and that might be from poetry, but I also feel like it is from just playwriting and drama. It made me very oral.
There's a necessary like economy and rhythm
Yes.
that comes along with
Yes.
having to perform something.
Yeah. So, yes.
So you teach Afrofuturist work at Tulane.
I have, yes.
Are there authors that you would recommend to us?
Oh my goodness, yes. But the classic, someone was just asking about, it's like, yeah, like Octavia Butler is like the classic, and everybody should read her. Yeah. I called it, I think that I was really interested in things that sort of exceed the parameters of realism. And it's very related to what I was saying about history as like an official narrative, and sometimes I don't want to spend a lot of time trying to argue against it. So things that exceed the boundaries of real, because I sort of feel like realism is a construct, right?
Yes.
That sort of functions in the same way. So I try personally not to feel restricted by the need to sort of operate within those boundaries. So what another person is Henry Dumas that we read, who was actually someone that was, Toni Morrison edited his book. So,
oh, how wonderful.
Yeah, and a lot of, I mean, there's a lot of, oh my gosh, I should know, I can only think of books, I can't think of the title, I mean the names of the authors, but yeah, there's a lot. I would just start with that. Read Octavia Butler and
Octavia Butler.
Yeah. Du Bois wrote science fiction too.
Did he really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, these two stories. One is, I mean, it's just interesting because he wrote them. One's called The Comet, and it's like a sort of a post-apocalypse story. And then there's another one where Jesus comes and he's in Texas and he's black. So it's like but it's just, yeah. So yeah, he wrote stuff like that too. But there's a lot. There's definitely a very strong, lineage you can trace in terms of science fiction. I that has a specific sort of trajectory, and I really, when I taught the class that I was interested in, is again like works that in various ways sort of exceed those parameters, because sometimes it's necessary, and you can really see that I think in fiction and art, the idea of how reality is represented. There's a lot of assumptions that are actually very embedded, implicit assumptions that maybe do not actually realistically reflect everyone's experience of the world. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
There's actually a lot of moral assumptions often that are sort of implied that, you don't really. They're not. They're structured. They're constructs.
Right.
Really.
Right. Even from like a cognitive or a philosophical point of view, the idea of reality is not is not this rigid thing that we are taught to believe it is. Yeah. Yeah.
But and also experientially too.
Right.
This is like, so that was like in part the point of that. I take a lot of inspiration from artists that have not been sort of allowed their imaginations to be confined by that. Yeah. Ginny is that kind of artist.
Yes, she really is.
Yeah, I'm not going to be confined by what other people tell me I can and cannot do. Yeah. So
there's a lot about your characters and your work that pushes up against the boundaries in ways that are not completely shattering to those boundaries, but show how they can be pressed in one direction or the other. Yeah. Yeah.
I draw a lot of inspiration from that. I see that a lot in there's so many amazing people, and you're like, how in the world did they do that? How did they contribute this? How did they? And it's just there's so underneath it. It's just sort of the will to keep going. As Johnny Ribkin says, not Mr. Sitwell, but Ginny is definitely like that as well.
Yeah, to refuse the limits. Do you have any idea what you're going to do next?
Well, I have a collection of short stories coming out next year.
Oh, exciting.
And that's a totally different thing. Those are all set in sort of the same community in Florida. And then I'm always working on another novel, because that's what I like to do.
I understand.
Yeah.
That's exciting.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, thank you. It was lovely.
It was really, really lovely to
Yeah.
speak to you and to spend so much time with your work.
Thank you. Thank you.
I hope that everyone goes out and gets themselves both the Rib King and the Talented Ribkins immediately from your independent local bookstore.
Thank you.